the 3rd Legion was saved by the discovery of their Primarch. Guided by chance or the wisdom of the Emperor, the Great Crusade came to long-forgotten Chemos. It was a grey-skied and grey-skinned mining world, where hope was thin and drudgery the coin of life. Slow decay was the fate of the isolated human population that abided there. Privation was common on Chemos, and there were doubtless hardships to be endured. But there have been those that have wryly observed that by comparing the fates of many Primarchs, Fulgrim was blessed. On this drab world, the Primarch had grown and risen to a position of power. Fulgrim himself was pale-skinned and fine-boned, like some ancient paragon of grace given life. Ash-white hair framed his handsome face, and his violet eyes held a spark of delight. In war, thought, craft, and creation, he excelled effortlessly. The details of his life and the influence of Chemos on Fulgrim have been told several times over by diverse hands. A significant fact is that Fulgrim had become a beacon of hope amongst the fading existence of the people of Chemos. His presence had driven a resurgence of craft, art, and intellectual refinement, and through dint of his intellect and achievements, he had stopped the backsliding of this hard-scrabble world and set it upon a path, if not to greatness, then at least a betterment of its lot. Grown on stony ground, this reaching for something better would never attain great heights, but the will to grasp the greatness Fulgrim inspired was strong. The reunion of father and son was a warm one, and the accession of Chemos into the Imperial fold smooth and eagerly accomplished. And soon, the Emperor gave Fulgrim charge of the dying 3rd Legion. Numbering only 200, they arrayed before him. They were so few that each of them bore a banner of a company that had either perished or now only numbered a handful of warriors. They were unbowed and stood with pride, as if in defiance of fate. Did Fulgrim see an echo of the struggle of Chemos in his remaining Gene-sons? We cannot know, but at that moment he knelt before his own legion. When he rose, he spoke to them, telling his Gene-sons of their destiny, of how they must shake off the misfortunes of the past and rise to heights that others dare not. You are the Emperor's chosen, his heralds, his warriors, his children, for this is only the beginning. Okay, there's no way around this. Whilst editing this video, I noticed that the nose pads on my glasses are completely messed up. Neither of us noticed this for the entire recording, we're just gonna have to live with it. Emperor, forgive me. Hello folks, welcome back to the channel, where today we're going to be talking about perfection, and I don't just mean my illustrious co-host. Welcome back to the channel, Whipster.
Thank you, thanks for the introduction, it's good to be back.
We haven't done one of these for a little while. Recently we've both been waylaid with an uncomfortable amount of funerals, really. Bet you feel bad if you made fun of my glasses now, huh? But we are now back, and we intend to do these on a pretty regular basis, and we thought, as Fulgrim is about to come out, we talk about certainly one of your favourite topics, Alex, and that is Loyalist Fulgrim.
Yes, absolutely. I have 3,000 points of Horus Heresy, Loyalist Emperor's Children, and I'm ready to talk about this.
I understand the appeal. I totally get it, because they're one of the few legions that doesn't seem so obviously bad from the start. If you look at Perturabo's upbringing, Mortarian's kind of meeting the Emperor in Typhus, obviously Angron, Conrad Kurz, Fulgrim, I think, actually stands a chance. And when people write their alternate versions of the heresy, I think that it makes a lot of sense to put Fulgrim on the Loyalist side.
A lot of the Primarchs, if you look at Mortarion, if you look at Angron especially, they had awful upbringings full of abuse and horror, and they were taken advantage of, whereas Fulgrim, like a lot of the Loyalists, actually had a pretty normal childhood. He had parents. They were simple workers in a factory who just tried to do their best for him, and then later he became like the ruler of the planet off his own back. But he looked back and he was like, they did their best with me. So yeah, he was given that head start a lot of the other Primarchs weren't.
Worship was a taboo word in his father's kingdom. There was no worship, for there were no gods. No demigods, only the Emperor and his sons, and the Imperium they would rule together. He fell into an easy rhythm, moving in loose circles about his private quarters. Every circle was a dance step and an attack in one. He had learned the war rhythms from the Sulfur in his youth. The Sulfur tribes had produced preeminent swordsmen and not much else. They had been nomads, and they'd believed that the only fit occupations for men were making war and dancing. Two things they did quite well. He stopped, falling out of the rhythm instantly. The Sulfur had been broken at his command. All that remained of them now were the lessons he'd learned in his time with them. They had been the last obstacle to his control of Chemos. A wild folk, unable to adapt to changing times. They had threatened the perfection he'd envisioned, and so he had destroyed them, one clan at a time, tribe by tribe. Some few Sulfur remained, scattered throughout his legion, but as a culture, they were nothing more than one memory amongst many. Still holding Fireblade extended, both hands tight about the hilt, Fulgrim bowed his head. "I am sorry," he murmured. He closed his eyes. The obliteration of the Sulfur had been a necessary evil. That didn't make it any easier to bear, however. He sometimes wondered what would have happened had he been found by such primitive folk, rather than a downtrodden pair of factory workers. Would he have been more like Russ, or even Horus? Perhaps that might have been better. For them, imperfection was somehow turned into strength. Corin and Talia had been capable parents, at best. Life in the fortress factory of Kallax had broken them early, and they withered even as he flourished. He rotated his wrists, angling the blade, and brought it around until it extended an isolated nook where two small plinths stood. Atop each plinth was a bust, one of Corin and one of Talia. Plain marble with no colour or gilt to distinguish them. Almost identical in their expressions of weary acceptance. It was hard to tell which was which at times, even for him. "You did the best you could," he said softly in benediction. Their imperfections had been no fault of their own. He spun on his heel, drawing the sword up in a savage cut. He had taken control of Kallax within a few months of being put to work there. Chemos had been dying then, its mines tapped, its ores plundered, civilization faltered, crumbling at the edges. The Sulfur had not been alone in their primitivism, merely the largest group. He remembered those first fierce brawls against the cannibal tribes inhabiting factories gone cold many centuries past. The doomed expedition to Deep Processor 1 and the monstrous thing he'd faced on the Forble board. For 50 years he had waged war against the inevitable, and on the day he'd won it, he'd learned that his war was nothing more than a skirmish in a far greater conflict. That his light was but one of many gleaming in a darkness more pervasive than he'd imagined. The Emperor had come to Chemos and illuminated the Illuminator. He had set the Phoenix's nest aflame so that Fulgrim might be reborn into a new and greater existence. But already, that existence was threatened, both within and without. He had made enemies merely by existing. He was used to that. On Chemos, he had been forced to navigate spheres of influence, as he slowly worked to break down and rebuild the old executive clan system. Like a machine that had outlived its purpose, the system had caused more problems than it solved. A blurt of sound from the Vox system caught his ear.
"My lord, we are entering orbit over 28-1,
Abdemon said, his voice shrouded in static. Fulgrim lowered his sword. "Understood. Assemble the others in the disembarkation bay. I will meet you there shortly." He sheathed Fireblade with a flourish and turned to bow to the busts of his foster parents. Fulgrim smiled. It's a really good point, and I think today let's have a conversation about whether Fulgrim kind of was the perfect Primarch in a lot of respects, and We'll focus on the Palantine Phoenix, but we're also going to talk a little bit today about Ferrus Manus' Primarch novel, where the Emperor's children do make a good appearance. We have, of course, Fulgrim in the book Fulgrim, and his youth is also covered a little bit, Angel Exterminatus. And then we're also going to dive a little bit into the world of Fabius Bile for obvious reasons, to understand whether Fulgrim was perfect. But let's start off then with Palantine Phoenix, because, yeah, you bring up some really interesting points there. Fulgrim's youth was quite different in a lot of ways. A big way that his youth was very different, he actually got married.
I was betrothed once. Several times, actually. Political marriages, of course, made to seal binding agreements or open negotiations with certain executive dynasties. His tone had become somber, a rare thing for Fulgrim. The Phoenician seemed to always be smiling, laughing at some joke only he understood. But now he seemed tired. He rubbed his face. I outlived them all, one way or another.
Did you love them?
Fulgrim smiled slowly. Some, I think, at first. After a time, I stopped. Love was a weakness I could ill afford in those days. 1 billion lives rested on my shoulders, and any hesitation on my part would have doomed them all irrevocably. He laughed softly. Or so I told myself then.
And now?
Now, I know it would have. There is no room for weakness in this galaxy. No room for imperfection.
Fulgrim eventually stopped loving. In Palantine Phoenix, he talks about how he kind of gave up on loving others because it's seen as a weakness. A very kind of Primarch view of the world, and we get that classic Primarch story. The Primarch rises and he completely transformed the whole world and turned it into much more of kind of a paradise planet by the time the Emperor found him. And the Emperor's reunion with Fulgrim, again, very uncharacteristically for a traitor Primarch, they actually got along very well from the start, and Fulgrim was immediately kind of sworn to the Emperor's side, which made a lot of sense because the Emperor's children were already very beloved by the Master of Mankind.
The sort of foundational story, I think it's like really good to start off with the Emperor's Children, is their founding, is everything that happens before Fulgrim is reunited with them. The Emperor's Children are a contradiction in so many ways. They have this ethos that they want to be perfect, they want to be the best, but they have always had this genetic instability in them from the beginning. Even so far back as, their original founding, they had, the gene seed blight, which destroyed a lot of their gene seed reserves, utterly ruined the Legion. They had, problems with their gene seed, which caused, gene seed failure, caused a lot of deaths among the Emperor's children.
It was described by Fabius Bile as a viral blight that affected the very gene seed of the Legion. A time bomb ticking away within the cells of each of Fulgrim's sons. The genetic flaw had driven the Legion low. There was a constant danger of slipping back into oblivion due to their weakened state. Even those gene sons born on Chemos were not immune to this malignant imperfection. Once, the blight had been the Aleph of Fabius's existence. It nestled within the gene seed of the Emperor's children, flourishing unseen until the moment it began to devour its host. Only by his efforts had it been prevented from utterly obliterating the Third Legion in the early days of the Great Crusade. Even so, they'd been whittled down to scarcely 200 in number. Then had come Fulgrim, and the infusion of fresh, untainted gene seed. Or so they'd thought. But the blight was as hardy as the warriors it afflicted. It had rallied, spreading through the new recruits like a scouring flame, despite his best efforts. He felt a sudden weariness, as if his thoughts were wrapped in heavy chains. His first failure, and his greatest, the echoes of which still haunted him. As far as he knew, he was the last sufferer of that scourge. Perhaps it was because he was the last of his legion as yet untainted by the touch of the warp, cursed by his own purity. A cruel jest, but then the universe knew no other kind. He laughed bitterly.
And then obviously they had their gene seed reserves. At the time, they didn't know this, but stolen by Trays in the Infinite. So by the time Fulgrim reached them, there was only, 200 of them left?
Yes.
And so that by itself is really interesting. But if you look sort of a little bit deeper than that, one of the sort of offhand things they say about the Emperor's Children is, despite the fact that they've always had this sort of ethos of perfectionism, albinism is something that has always run through the Legion in many ways. Like that's one of the ways that Fulgrim is described. Very pale skin, very white hair. In some ways, they have always had this imperfection as intrinsic as part of their character in the Legion. And that, combined with all of the, past tribulations the Legion went through during its founding, means that at their core, the Emperor's Children and Fulgrim himself have a deep-seated insecurity about their place in the Imperium. They've always seen themselves as one thing. They've always seen themselves as, we are the perfect exemplars of what it means to be, the pinnacle of humanity. But they've always had these things wrong with them in the back of their mind. Watching that play out throughout every single story that they're in, to me, is fascinating. It's one of the reasons why I really love the Legion. There are certain points in the story of the Emperor's Children that become these fulcrum points around which their history sort of takes place. And it's always one of two ways they can go. They can either overcome their insecurities and become the best versions of themselves, or just not do that at all and go the other way. And it's almost like a series of tipping points, one after another, until they fall straight into the arms of chaos. And so, yeah, it's fascinating. We'll talk a little bit more of that as we go.
Yeah, there is this kind of paradox about them because, you mention every book. One thing I checked for this video was in every single Emperor's Children novel, or near enough, they do mention that they have the Palantine Aquila. So if you're not familiar, this is a really unique honor that the Emperor's Children have, and they are very proud of it. And as I say, it is mentioned all of the time. If they appear in a novel, there is a good chance they will bring this up to whoever they're speaking to. It comes from something called the Proximan Betrayal. It was after the Proximan Betrayal that the Emperor's Children Legion was granted the exclusive right to bear the Palantine Aquila, the Emperor's personal standard in its heraldry. This honor was bought in blood as the Legion's 26th cohort, assigned to the Proxima compliance ceremonies and honor guard, fought and died to the last warrior alongside the Legio Custodes, never giving ground during the insurrectionists' surprise attack on the ceremonial plaza. By their sacrifice was the wounded emperor, who had suffered injury by use of a vortex weapon, bought time to recover and fight his way clear of the insurrectionist trap. In recognition of this, the standard of the Palantine Aquila, so fiercely fought for the day, was given to them by the emperor's own hand, to be their relic ever after, along with the right to end the Proxima revolt by exterminatus and so repay the blood that was owed them. While the Great Aquila in its variations signifies both the Imperium of humanity and loyalty to the Emperor as its matter, and there is much allegory bound up in its form. For the Emperor's Children, it also now represented their own deeds as well, an honor never given to another legion. So during this event in the Great Crusade, this is before Fulgrim was found, the Emperor's Children literally fought to the last man in some instances, buying the Emperor's life with their lives and dying. Henceforth, the Emperor's Children alone earned the right to bear the Palantine Aquila for their actions on Proxima. Like you say, this is a massive point of pride for the Legion, and they bring it up all the time, but there is huge insecurity within the Legion, and this insecurity is the background of Fulgrim's Primarch novel, Palantine Phoenix. Exactly as Quipster says, when Fulgrim was found by the Emperor, there are about 200 Emperor's Children left because there have been so many problems with their gene seed. There's been problems essentially like kind of carcinogenic level issues. The Legion numbers have been massively depleted. This is why people like Fabius Bile are so big within the Legion, because not only are they from Terra and from like the original kind of cohorts, but they're one of the very few to have survived, and his life has been dedicated to saving his own Legion, and that's probably the basis of his entire development as a character. So henceforth, given that the Legion numbers were so low, there wasn't really any point in sending the Emperor's Children out to go and, bring planets into compliance, because they just didn't have the numbers to do it. So for a long time, Fulgrim worked kind of under Horus Lupercal, and that's why Fulgrim and Horus have this incredibly close relationship. Even as the Emperor's Children grew again in strength, they were still a shattered remnant when compared with their brother legions. The Emperor's Children numbered just a few hundred, while the Ultramarines had already been the first to breach the mark of 100,000 Space Marines. And beside them, the larger legions, such as the Imperial Fists and the Lunar Wolves, had numbers enough to prosecute multiple campaigns alone. Even the 20th Legion, young as it was, and yet without its Primarch, had greater numbers in the field. Seeing the need to nurture the Emperor's Children's recovery, the Emperor asked Horus to mentor Fulgrim. So it was that for over a decade, the Emperor's Children and the Lunar Wolves fought side by side. The bond of brotherhood and trust, forged in battle between Fulgrim and Horus, unalike as they were, became unbreakable. So also did their legions grow close, just as unalike in temperament, but equal in skill. Both legions and Primarchs seemed to complement one another. Where Horus was swift and intuitive, Fulgrim was patient and considered. Where the Lunar Wolves were direct and brutal, the Emperor's Children were flexible and subtle. When eventually the Emperor's Children broke away to stand on their own, they had become oath brothers to the Lunar Wolves. It was a bond that treachery one day would twist into a chain to shackle their souls. Eventually, of course, the numbers of the Emperor's Children are slowly starting to rise. However, Fulgrim is still massively insecure. So Fulgrim decides to bring the world of Byzas to compliance with just 6 Space Marines. And this is something, of course, that is going to become an absolute legend within the Great Crusade, the Legion that only requires 6 Marines to bring a world into compliance. And I know that this book for you is quite important in how you view the Emperor's Children, isn't it?
100%. Honestly, this is actually one of my favorite books I've ever read from all of literature. There's something in the heart of this book that I really enjoy, and I think a big chunk of it is because it starts with this level of insecurity. That's exactly where the book begins, because the whole reason why Fulgrim wants to do this whole thing, conquer Byzas with only 6 Marines, is because he has something to prove. Every single time we see him in any story, he has something to prove. In this case, it's that the Emperor's Children have only just been recognized as being strong enough as being able to go off and do operations by themselves without anyone looking over their shoulder. Now, if we look at how prideful Primarchs are, no Primarch is going to enjoy being babysat for most of the Great Crusade. And so, yeah, Fulgrim has a lot to prove to everyone that he's just like, yeah, I can do this. I don't need anyone's help. I've got this. And so he tries to do it in obviously the most extreme way possible. Like, I'm not just going to conquer this planet. I'm going to do it with 6 guys because I'm just that good and I've got this. That extremity that he goes to every single time when he's trying to do anything is something that is very deep-seated in his character, and that insecurity. And I gotta say, it actually does really good things for him a lot of the time. That's actually kind of the problem. Because if you look at where the Emperor's Children end up by Istvan 3, Istvan 5, at the beginning of the heresy, they've gone from 200 Marines when Fulgrim rejoins the Legion, maybe 200 years beforehand, to over 120,000 when the heresy begins. They have their numbers, drastically cut by the Carl of Istvan 3, but he actually does successfully rebuild his legion. He forges his reputation. His most toxic trait of his insecurity actually turns out to be a weird kind of strength, even if it leads him down this, path of darkness in the end. This is where the Palantine Phoenix starts. It starts with him having something to prove and him thinking the only way I can do this is in the most extreme way possible.
This is 28-1, Byzas to its inhabitants, of whom there are several billion, a not inconsiderable number given what it has endured of late. We will bring Byzas to compliance, but not through fire and blood. 6 blades, and 6 blades alone, I will carry into this battle. You are those blades. Why are we doing this? To bring this world into compliance. But why this way? The risk outweighs the benefits. Fulgrim was silent for several moments, then he sighed and said, "My brothers challenge me, and as the challenged, the battlefield and weapons are mine to choose." He smiled. Russ thought he was being clever when he suggested I take command of the 28th expedition, 28 being a positive integer that is equal to the sum of its proper divisors, mathematically perfect. He laughed softly. I would have expected that suggestion from Ferrus, or maybe even Horus, but never Russ. He has hidden depths, that one. Well hidden, Abdamon agreed. Fulgrim laughed again. Now, that is one of the Emperor's sons you're insulting, Abdamon, and my brother. He paused. My mangy, flea-infested barbarian of a brother. He glanced at his subordinate. I accepted the challenge, of course. It is needful that I make the true extent of our capabilities known. Already, those discovered after me have outstripped me in accomplishment. We have lingered in our sick bed for too long, Abdamon. Our numbers grow, but slowly, and our resources are unwisely diverted down ulterior paths by those who seek to protect us. Abdamon said nothing. He had fought alongside the sons of 3 legions in his time, and the thought that they might be to blame for the current predicament, even unknowing, was anathema. Fulgrim continued. Do you know, I think they pity us. They pity me, and I will not have it. We are not to be pitied, but respected. He turned from his reflection. You asked me why. That is your answer. We must do this thing, and do so perfectly, in order to show them that our worth is beyond question. If we do not stand on our own now, we will forever be but a shadow of what we might have been.
One of the reasons I think I like it so much is because I think a lot of my flaws are reflected in Fulgrim. Like, I'm a massive perfectionist. Like, this is why I collect Emperor's Children. I'm a massive insecure perfectionist, as are they. Therefore, I shall collect them. But one thing that really screws up Fulgrim, and he doesn't recognize quite in himself, isn't his arrogance. I think it's really easy to look at a novel, look at the Emperor's Children, look at Fulgrim and say, oh, they failed in these ways because they were arrogant. It's not quite that. They were arrogant. It's not quite that. It's that they didn't trust anyone. They didn't trust anyone to get the job done in the way they needed it to be done. So they did everything themselves. There's a bit where Fulgrim ends up talking to the leaders of this resistance movement. And he's looking at them and he's just like, okay, we'll have to go through all these theatrical nonsense things so that I can talk to them. Fine. Okay, I know who these people are. I can hear their heartbeats. I can smell their pheromones. I know you're that person, etc. He looks at them and he goes, okay, what you're doing isn't going to work. Like, it's just not going to work. And it's not going to work because I'm telling you it's not going to work. But we discover later in the novel that if he had trusted them, if he had trusted their opinions, it would have been more successful, the Emperor's Children and Fulgrim's campaign on the planet. They would have created a better world. Instead, Fulgrim bulldozes straight through all the problems that are put before him in an almost artless way in some ways, just to get his objective, to prove that he's worthy. And it's to his detriment. And it's to the detriment, frankly, of the Imperium. Because they haven't created this world that is as stable as it could be. They haven't created this world that is as dynamic and secure in the long term as it could be. He doesn't do that. All he does is try and satisfy his insecurities because he's got something to prove. And it's to the detriment of the overall mission. And that's the flaw with Fulgrim. He feels like he can't trust anyone else because he's got so much to prove. That's why I find him to be such a tragic figure, really.
There are some points from Palantine Phoenix that I did want to focus on because, as you say, it does do a lot for his character. Firstly, let's talk a little bit about his kind of fighting style. Let's have a look at some of the fun stuff. So this book does a really cool job. It has one of my favorite Primarch fighting moments ever. I've spoken about this before on the channel. They try to assassinate Fulgrim, naturally, in the novel, because they don't want him to conquer their planet. And so someone takes a sniper shot at him, and he cuts the bullet in half in the air, which is somewhat impressive. He is also described as being so fast in the novel, and it's one of the very few times in Primarch stories where we really get an emphasis on how quick they are. The other Primarch, who we'll talk about later, is Jaghatai Khan, who's famously fast. But Fulgrim in this novel is so fast, we get this really awesome passage where they talk about time kind of slowing down and how quickly Fulgrim can kind of react to things. And likewise, it is directly said in the novel that Fulgrim was considered the fastest of the Primarchs. And in terms of who is going to be the best fighter, that's always going to be a massive deal because lots of the Primarchs are very strong. But if you can't dance away from one of Fulgrim's poison blades, as Gilliman will tell you, then it's not going to be a good day.
It's very interesting. The way they emphasize how fast Fulgrim is. All the Primarchs have their Primarch ability, their special Primarch magic power. They emphasize it to the point of Fulgrim's special magic Primarch power is speed. I always find it interesting. There's the comparison between him and Jaghatai Khan in many ways, because later on in the Heresy, we find out Jaghatai Khan was actually supposed to be the one that ends up on Chemos.
Yes.
And Fulgrim is the one who's supposed to end up on Chagorus. It's really interesting because I think a lot of people mistake what the Khan's Primarch power actually is, because they look at his Legion and they say, oh, he's all about speed and they do things quickly. No, that's not his Primarch power. His Primarch power, firstly, in a fight, is you don't quite know where he is. You don't quite understand in your brain's spatial awareness where the space he occupies is. And that, going to a more sort of existential psychological aspect, means that you're never sure of his intentions and you always forget about him when decision making. That's the other part of his Primarch power. It's almost the complete and total opposite of Fulgrim, because Fulgrim's entire deal is you always know exactly where he is. You always know exactly what he's doing. And if you didn't, he'll tell you.
You're on to a really hot topic for me because the Fulgrim-Khan relationship is, I don't want to say underdeveloped, but I think there's so much more to tell in their relationship because it's one of the funnest? It's one of the most fun Primarch relationships. There's some hilarious lines from Jaghatai Khan. But yeah, this idea, as you talk about, Alex, where they were supposed to land on opposite worlds, this is according to Magnus the Red, that is a massive deal, and potentially they are the opposites, and they do have a lot of similarities, and a rivalry clearly builds between them. So this is kind of talked about in the book Scars. You really get a difference between the two Primarchs here. So this is a very famous passage within Warhammer 40k. This is a flashback to before the Heresy, and the Primarchs were often boasting about kind of who the best fighter is. And Sanguinius says something that's very similar to you in another book, actually quips the way he talks about the Khan, and he says that I don't know if I could beat the Khan because nobody understands the Khan, which is a really interesting idea. But Fulgrim is very confident in himself. In the aftermath of the Ulanor campaign, the Primarchs Sanguinius, Mortarion, Jaghatai Khan, and Fulgrim discussed Horus's recent appointment to War Master. Sanguinius looked at the Khan thoughtfully. I thought you, of all of us, would feel joy for Horus. The Khan shrugged. He is the best of us. I begrudge him nothing, and I have told him so. But it should never have happened. So it should have been you? Asked Fulgrim. Mortarion snorted again, but Sanguinius said nothing.
I wouldn't have taken it,
said the Khan.
Of course you would have,
said Fulgrim. The Khan shook his head.
I have no use for another title. My people give me enough.
Sanguinius smiled. My brother, I think you are the most inscrutable of us all. I know what Rogel wants, and I know what Rabute wants, but even after so long, I have no idea what you want.
He wants to be left alone, said Fulgrim, to shoot off into the stars and hunt down Xenos on those delightful jet bikes. They're devilishly fast. I heard from a contact at Mars, Jaghatai, that you do strange things to your ships.
The Khan shot him a heavy-lidded stare.
I heard you do strange things to your warriors.
Fulgrim's slender face briefly flared with anger, but Sanguinius laughed. I wonder which one of you would win in a duel, the angel mused. I would like to see that. You both handle a blade like gods. Name the place, brother, Fulgrim said to the Khan. I'd even travel to Chigoris, if you built a palace to keep the dust from my armor. The Khan felt the insult. It stabbed at him deeply, but his expression never changed. They could never know, none of them, how much their close fraternity rankled him.
You would lose,
said the Khan. Fulgrim grinned, but there was something fragile in it.
Oh. You would lose because you would treat it like a game, like you treat everything, and I would not. You would lose because you know nothing of me, and I know everything of you, because you shout it from the turrets of your battlecruisers. My prowess remains unknown. You have some reputation as a swordsman, brother, but I make no boast when I tell you I would leave you choking on it.
This is a mic drop moment, and all the other Primarchs around are like, fuck. Don't mess with Jaghatai Khan. And another thing on the Khan, I will just mention, because I'm sure some White Scars fans will be in the comments. To be fair, the conversation of who's faster is slightly up in the air, because in the Khan's novel, there's this concept of Alec Ger, which is spoken about, which is this point Jaghatai Khan can get to. He moves so fast and he's fighting against orcs, and it said his thoughts alone can kill. That's how fast he moves. So presumably Fulgrim has never seen Jaghatai Khan at this level, but that's not confirmed. So it's not clear whether the other Primarchs are aware of just how fast the Khan can be. He doesn't, for example, use the power of Alec Ger against Demon Mortarion in the book Warhawk. It looks like the Khan needs a bit of a run-up, but that's kind of how I would guess it, is that if you give the Khan a run-up, he's going to be the fastest. But in, just who's got the fastest reactions, who's going to be able to dodge bullets, etc., my money's on Fulgrim. Lumen Russ says that Fulgrim is too proud as a fighter, kind of in line with Jaghatai Khan's comments. So clearly he thinks that Fulgrim's pride in this instance is going to be his downfall in terms of combat. But it's interesting because I always operate on the assumption that Fulgrim is one of the better fighters. So many of them are excellent swordsmen, but being the fastest is objectively just such an asset. And so, yeah.
As someone who is a swordsman, I can tell you for a fact, it is something that's very handy to have.
That's true.
It's interesting as well to go back to that conversation they're having at Ulanor, where the Khan goes like, oh, I'd make you choke on your words or whatever. Because, number one, to me, that entire conversation is like fairly in jest. Sanguinius is kind of like, oh yeah, wouldn't it be funny? And Fulgrim's like, yeah, that would be really funny. If you build a palace, I'll come to your world. And he's quite, joking about it. And then the Khan's just like, I will kill you. Full stop. Like, I will just murder you. And everyone's just like, Jesus Christ, calm down.
Yeah.
So
it's very likable.
But it's interesting because it kind of shows the dichotomy there between the two, because they are in so many ways reflections of each other. They have similar abilities. They have very similar aspects in a lot of their legions, except for the fact that they are so mirrored. So you've got, for example, the noble savagery of the White Scars It's not put on. It's not an affectation. That's just what they're like. As part of that, I think they have a very deep-seated confidence in who they are and what they're about. And I think that comes through in a lot of the White Scar novels. Now, the exact opposite of that is the Emperor's Children. They spend so much time thinking about what everyone else thinks about themselves, thinks about them. They spend so much time on pursuits like art, music, not because they like art and music. They pursue these things to be the best, so everyone has to sit up and notice them. It comes again from this place of insecurity, whereas the same thing, the White Scars, they are actually famed for their art, their poetry, but they don't need to shout from the rooftops about it because they do it for themselves. They do it for the pleasure of doing it. It's fascinating to me. You've got these two sides of the same coin almost, or like dark reflections of each other. And that goes back to the idea that Slaanesh was either going for the White Scars or the Emperor's Children.
I mean, like you say, he conquers Byzas with 6 Space Marines. And just as when Mortarion is quite obsessed with the number 7, you can't help but read these passages and you're like, I think someone may already have their hooks in you then. And I do wonder whether the Emperor ever looked at these legions and he thought to himself, that's concerning at the very least. But
I wonder why they picked purple. That's a surprising color.
Yeah, no, exactly. You talk about perfection, which I think is a pretty good segue to looking more into Ferrus Manus's relationship with Fulgrim, because that, of course, is, I mean, in a way, it is the big relationship. It is outright said in the books that Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim are closer than any two brothers, but likewise, the same is also said about Sanguinius and Horus. Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, however, for me, are quite funny in that they're quite an unlikely friendship. I remember that when I first read Fulgrim, and they just keep saying they're friends, and they get along so well, and we have this legendary tale of them meeting and then both kind of being in awe of each other's craftsmanship, but they don't seem to have much in common.
The Emperor's Children were the most beloved of legions to the Iron Hands. The brotherhood shared by Fulgrim and Ferrus was well known, the two demigods having formed an instant connection upon their first meeting. Santar knew the tale, his Primarch having told it many times over the feast table. The details known so well to him, it was as though he had been there himself. It had been beneath Mount Narodnia, the greatest forge of the Urals, where the Primarchs had first met. Ferrus Manus toiling with the Forge Masters who had once served the Terrawat clan during the Unification Wars. The Primarch of the Iron Hands had been demonstrating his phenomenal skill and miraculous powers of his liquid metal hands when Fulgrim and his Phoenix Guard had descended upon the sprawling forge complex. Neither Primarch had yet met the other, but each had felt the shared bonds of alchemy and science that had gone into their making. Both were like gods unto the terrified artisans, who prostrated themselves before these two mighty warriors, as though fearing a terrible battle. Ferrus Manus would then tell Santar of how Fulgrim had declared that he had come to forge the most perfect weapon ever created, and that he would bear it in the coming crusade. Of course, the Primarch of the Iron Hands could not let such a boast go unanswered, and he had laughed in Fulgrim's face, declaring that such pasty hands as his could never be the equal of his own metal ones. Fulgrim had accepted the challenge with regal grace, and both Primarchs had stripped to the waist, the forge ringing with the deafening pounding of hammers, the hiss of cooling metal, and the good-natured insults of these two young gods as they sought to outdo one another. At the end of the 3 months' unceasing toil, both warriors had finished their weapons. Fulgrim had forged an exquisite warhammer that could level a mountain with a single blow, and Ferrus Manus a golden-bladed sword that forever burned with the fire of the forge. Both weapons were unmatched by any yet crafted by man, and upon seeing what the other had created, each Primarch declared that his opponent's was the greater. Fulgrim had declared the golden sword the equal of that borne by the legendary hero Nuada Silverhand, while Ferrus Manus had sworn that only the mighty thunder gods of Nordic legend were fit to bear such a magnificent warhammer. Without another word spoken, both Primarchs had swapped weapons and sealed their eternal friendship with the craft of their hands. Santar looked down at the weapon, feeling the power within it and knowing that more than just skill had gone into its forging. Love and honor, loyalty and friendship, death and vengeance, all were embodied within its majestic form, and the thought that his Primarch's sworn honor brother had created this weapon made it truly legendary. Despite such a strong bond, Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus held distinctly different philosophies regarding the concept of perfection. Fulgrim equated perfection with artistic beauty, cultural pursuits, and flawless martial detail. He saw the pursuit of perfection extending to the fine arts and music, and his legion strived for excellence in all things. On the other hand, Ferrus Manus had little time for art, music, or any of the cultural pastimes the Emperor's children enjoyed. It is said that after the two of them met at Mount Narodnia, they returned to the Imperial Palace, where Sanguinius had arrived, bearing gifts from the Emperor. Exquisite statues from the glowing rock of Baal, priceless gemstones, and wondrous artifacts of aragonite, opal, and tourmaline. The Lord of the Blood Angels had brought enough to fill a dozen wings of the palace with the greatest wonders imaginable. Fulgrim was enthralled, finding that another of his brothers shared his love of such incredible beauty. But Ferrus Manus was unimpressed, and said that such things were a waste of their time when there was a galaxy to win back. It's even been speculated that it was at this moment Fulgrim laughed and declared him a terrible Gorgon. The name stuck.
It's in Ferrus Manus's Primarch novel where we get a bit more of an explanation on why they're so close. And Ferrus Manus, for example, says at one point, or he agrees with one of his sons, who talks about how Fulgrim is a greater artisan or philosopher than, I think it's Aristotle and Xenophon. That's the degree to which Fulgrim is admired by his brother. And to give some context to that, Ferrus Manus is famously quite stoic and doesn't readily give compliments. So despite their contrasting differences, Fulgrim, the elegant Phoenician, and Ferrus, the rugged Gorgon, they recognized their shared pursuit of perfection, and this mutual aspiration formed the bedrock of their connection, as both strived for excellence and demanded it from those loyal to them. While their methods diverged, their ultimate goal and unwavering conviction remained aligned. Their differences, though pronounced, were merely superficial. Fulgrim sought to overcome obstacles with elegance, scaling them to reach new heights, whereas Ferrus preferred shattering them through sheer determination, walking over the remnants of defiance. Ferrus harboured no animosity for Fulgrim calling him the hideous Gorgon at one point, embracing it as a fitting representation of his nature. Once again, I really like this depiction because I like seeing the Primarchs as actual kind of brothers. And when you get these really human moments, it's one of the reasons I like the Lion and Russ. Not only are they very impressive characters, they behave so human in some instances. And I think that Lehman Russ's Primarch novel does such a good job of that. But that's the thing I liked most about Ferrus's story there.
100%. I think these little moments of them actually being siblings are things we don't really get enough of, but when we do get them, they hit so hard. Because, I've got a brother and a sister. I've met your brother, and how many times have we had fights with our siblings and let's call each other names? And at the end of the day, you know your brother so well, you know your siblings so well. It doesn't take more than a couple of words to get the meaning of everything you're trying to get across to them. And I think one of the best moments I've seen in the Heresy that exemplifies that point is it's actually a moment between Mortarion and the Khan, and basically it's in Warhawk, and the Khan is seeing Mortarion for the first time, looks at him, and then all he says is, "Wings." Really? My brother would say that to me if I was wearing a stupid jacket. He'd be like, "Really? You're going to wear that out?"
Yes. It's quite funny as well because Mortarian's form, of all the demon Primarchs, he looks mostly the same, just with wings.
Yeah, just with wings.
Which, yeah, is superb.
I love that.
Certainly the
And
same can't be said for Fulgrim.
Oh yeah, exactly. But it's interesting. Those like brotherly moments, like, and this is the very frustrating thing about the relationship between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim. We don't get much of it at all. Like, we just don't get a lot of it.
Yeah,
like,
tragically.
there's very little of them just kind of hanging out and being bros. I wanted some of it in the Ferrus Manus Primarch novel. I wanted some of it in Palantine Phoenix, but we didn't get a lot.
There are a couple of great moments, as I say, where we do see that. One of Ferrus Manus' sons does say that Fulgrim constantly brags about Ferrus Manus. He's always talking about how much he loves Ferrus Manus, and he brags about him more than he even brags about Horus. And when you think that Fulgrim was one of the Primarchs that immediately bowed his head and meant it when Horus was named War Master, if you read between the lines here, it's very clear just how much Fulgrim admires Ferrus Manus. The book Fulgrim is kind of wonderful in two ways. A, it's just a very good book, but also the first 5 books are written as like a set, and Fulgrim is interwoven with the previous 4, which is pretty cool. This was written at a time when they didn't think the series would be as long as it was, or would really be a series. So yes, Ferrus Manus is killed very quickly.
Even though they don't get much screen time together, they still talk about each other quite a lot. Fulgrim says, I wish my brother was here. Like, I wish Ferrus was here. Like, I miss him. And there are bits in, Ferrus's novel where he says, I really miss Fulgrim. I wish he was here. This would have been so much easier if he was. I think something that springs into my mind very quickly is the bit at the end of Palantine Phoenix when he's trying to disarm that bomb. He's literally just looking at this bomb and his immediate thought isn't like, I can do this. His immediate thought is, I wish Ferrus was here. He'd look at this and just be able to like handle it like that.
Let's talk a little bit, because I think, again, in terms of things being mentioned very often, let's talk a bit about Fulgrim's actual form. If we're going to talk about perfection, the writers are very clear to just go overboard with how beautiful Fulgrim is. I've got some quotes here across like 5 novels. Fulgrim's voice is said to sound like music with perfect pitch and tone. He can pick up any new song by just listening to it. His skin is literally shiny. It has its luminous quality to it. His eyes are wide and friendly, and his lips hint at a smile. Fulgrim is described in Angel Exterminatus as having a sculpturally perfect body, which made me laugh. And when he's fighting, he is described as being a warrior in perfect balance. And likewise, in The Reflection Cracked, Lucius, who of course is obsessed with swordsmanship at that point and is dedicated to becoming the greatest swordsman of all time, when he sees Fulgrim cut Eidolon's head off, everyone else is, of course, like, holy cow, he just cut his Lord Commander's head off. But Lucius is just stunned. The movement the Fulgrim took to strike is just so unbelievably perfect, of course. The books are very clear. Fulgrim is a beautiful, beautiful man. Very fitting for Slaanesh.
100%. It's interesting. A lot of people have talked about Fulgrim and his beauty and his magnificence. But it's interesting when you get comparisons between Fulgrim and Sanguinius. Because obviously, like, Sanguinius is this unearthly, like, beautiful, angelic figure. But the way they're described is fascinating compared to each other, because you've got this angel on the one side, but the way Fulgrim is described is he's so beautiful and so statuesque that it's basically inhuman, but also he's seen by a lot of, like, normal humans as a lot more relatable in a lot of ways, a lot more personable in a lot of ways than most other Primarchs, to be honest. In the Palantine Phoenix, it talks about how it's actually very easy to just mistake Fulgrim for a really tall human and not a Primarch. You don't necessarily get the same level of what's called transhuman dread from Fulgrim as you do everything else, all the other Space Marines, because his proportions all kind of make sense. whereas in a normal Space Marine they just don't. He's just really tall. And so it's interesting how he's both portrayed as actually quite relatable and also inhuman looking on the other side. It reminds me a little bit of Vulcan, who's kind of the same thing in the opposite way. He's a nice guy who's like the most human, who looks like a demon. That humanity, that ease at which he can relate to people on their level, who can summon crowds, who can sway anyone with his charisma. And he knows he can do it. In some ways, it's almost an affectation. It's almost like he's putting on this charismatic shield because he knows it's useful to him. And, we get that with, Byzas, for example. There's the bit where he lifts that child onto his shoulders and he knows that there are cameras pointed at him. And he knows that the crowd is playing to him. And so he's just like, oh, thank you, child. You're going to be a prop for this. Let's let's go and let's have a fun time. He knows exactly how to use all of his abilities like this. It is a really fascinating thing about him that he's able to relate to the rank and file of humanity in a way that basically none of the Primarchs can, except maybe like Lorgar.
You do make a really good point, and it's where the Palantine Phoenix is really interesting. They talk a lot in the book about manipulating the world, because obviously there are only 6 Space Marines. So this is a lot about the hearts and minds of the planet and winning them over and demonstrating why they should join the Imperium of Man. But also there's one part of the book I did just want to talk about for a second, because it is said to be something that makes Fulgrim stand out, which is to your point about him being actually, believe it or not, a bit more humble. So there is a point towards the end of the novel. He talks about how he made several errors on Byzas, and he says this to a human. Other Primarchs just internalize their flaws, they just take them in, would never admit to making mistakes. Lorgar's a pretty good example of someone else that might accept they've made errors, but Fulgrim is kind of unique in this aspect, and I thought that was fascinating, and not something I expected, because I remember you talking about Palantine Phoenix for a while before I'd read it, and you really liked this novel. And I must say, throughout most of the book, they are still arrogant dicks. They are very detestable. Don't want to overdo it. But like, that scene is such a good scene to end on, and is a really good, if you want your moment of, oh, what might have been, that's that moment for me. Because maybe like modern day Guilliman or Lion, but outside of that, like in the Great Crusade, they are teenagers basically who are in commands of legions, and it is very evident.
100%. And like, it's really fascinating with Fulgrim, because again, that willingness to accept criticism and be like properly self-critical of his own flaws and mistakes. Again, it comes from this place of insecurity. It comes from this place of, I can't let this happen again. I have to learn these lessons. Otherwise, who knows what these mistakes will cost me in the future.
Such a great kind of view of Fulgrim. Perfection in terms of what a legion is and a commander is requires you to be quite humble. In order to pursue perfection, you have to admit your mistakes.
Yeah.
I do think we are going to have to talk about Clone Grim just a bit there, Alex, because it is no doubt going to be questioned in the comments.
Fabius Bio, in his relentless but twisted pursuit of creating a better future for humanity, embarked on the audacious endeavor of cloning the Primarchs. Among these attempts was a clone of Fulgrim, the Phoenician, which had been gestating for centuries and was discovered by Fabius in a state of accelerated development. This infant, described as physically perfect with violet eyes, exhibited rapid aging, progressing from infancy to adolescence within a short span of time. Despite the potential for warp corruption inherent in the Eye of Terra and the lengthy gestation, the clone remarkably showed no signs of mental or physical taint, leading Fabius to consider him a unique and perhaps even divinely bestowed being. As the Fulgrim clone matured, he displayed an innate understanding of combat and absorbed knowledge rapidly from data slates and books. He possessed fragmented memories, experiencing a sense of familiarity with events he had never personally witnessed. Fabius attributed these to encoded memories within the Primarch gene seed. The Primarchs somehow encoded their memories in their blood and marrow, like a cogitator backing up its data, a process not fully understood by Bile, and he had never been able to replicate it with any success. Through this, however, it appeared to Bile that he could possibly recreate Fulgrim in full. The nascent Fulgrim expressed a desire to understand his purpose and the world around him, questioning the suffering of others and a nascent sense of responsibility, even expressing sorrow for the fate of Ferrus Manus, the brother his original had killed.
I am not him. I read his words, the records of his deeds. I will never be him. I would not kill my brother. I would not betray my father. I will not succumb to such imperfection. Not once, not again.
Despite Fabius's initial intention to observe and potentially guide the clone of Fulgrim for his own ends, the young Primarch began to assert his own will and exert a powerful influence over all of Fabius's creations, including the new men. Fulgrim's charisma and inherent authority, reminiscent of his original self, drew all, including mutants and the Vatborn, to him, offering them a sense of purpose and protection. This development threatened Fabius's carefully laid plans, as the new men and even some of the Emperor's children began to look to Fulgrim for leadership, jeopardizing the apothecary's vision for a future led by his own creations and philosophies. Bile eventually came to believe that all of the Emperor's gene-crafted warriors, no matter how seemingly perfect, would always tend to damnation, and he could not allow himself to slip back into his old ways and let the future burn in the fires of the Phoenix's resurrection.
I am Fulgrim. I am told in the language of old Chemos, it means waterbringer, savior, and that is why I am here. To save you, all of you, from the last, from the least to the greatest. I do not want a new legion. I want to fix the one that is broken. I can fix them, teacher Fabius. I can teach them as you have taught me. I can pull them back from the brink, if you let me. Even now, they can be saved. I see it in them. I see the flicker of ancient fires, of honor and heroism. What they were, they can be again. If you but let me go, set me loose, Fabius, I shall free your brothers, my sons, from bondage. I can do this, I know it, as surely as I know my own name.
Ultimately, recognizing the danger posed by an uncorrupted Primarch gaining control of his work and potentially leading them down a path mirroring the failures of the past, Fabius made a drastic decision. During an encounter with the Necron Collector Trazyn the Infinite, Fabius offered the clone of Fulgrim to Trazyn in exchange for the Emperor's children's lost gene tithe. Despite the pleas of his creations, Fabius deemed it necessary to remove this unpredictable element from his plans, delivering the perfect, untainted Fulgrim into Trazyn's collection to safeguard his own ambitions for a new future for humanity.
Once again, this idea of perfection comes up because the concept of creating a perfect clone of a Primarch is something that is discussed at length, and the degree to which the clones are perfect, or at least some of them are, is questionable to say the least, because as we know, a huge part of what makes a Primarch is their kind of soul, and the degree to which that parts of that still exist to remain within Clone Grim is debatable. Nevertheless, this Fulgrim, once again, is described as looking like a perfect specimen, but the weird thing about him, he's a surprisingly innocent character, really, within the novel. He doesn't have that kind of hardness of spirit that came from his centuries of life lived. at some points in the novel, he actually looks up to Fabius Bile, kind of like Fabius Bile's his father. So it's a reversal of the relationship. But importantly, this version of Fulgrim doesn't have the physical or mental corruption that we see within, traitorous Fulgrim in the Heresy and later demonic Fulgrim. What was your thoughts when you first read Clone Grim? Did it dominate your thought process as it did for so many within the Warhammer community, it seems?
Dude, I wanted to cry when I finished that novel, honestly. This comes up again and again, these fulcrum points for the Emperor's Children, where they can go one way or the other. And this is one of those points. Because you have this clone, this like quote-unquote perfect clone form of Fulgrim. And he comes out and he's awesome. He's fantastic. And the Emperor's Children, legionaries that he encounters, he's wearing a sort of like a crude helmet and when he first meets them, so they can't see his face. But instantly, every single one of them looks at the body language, looks at the way that he moves, the way he fights, the way he, carries himself. And instantly, all of them go, holy shit, that's Fulgrim. What just happened? They all recognize instantly that it's him. It's fascinating because he's a clone. He's obviously having to grow up, even if that's accelerated. And by the time it's the end of the novel, it's kind of like a 19-year-old Fulgrim sort of equivalent. He's only really just becoming an adult, and he's probably not quite there yet, but he's still got the swagger. But the tragedy of Clone Fulgrim is that, you're right, he has none of this mental or physical corruption, but he still has all of Fulgrim's memories. He remembers killing Ferrus Manus. He's sad about it. So there's hope. Josh Reynolds, I think, is just an absolutely phenomenal writer. He gives you these nuggets and you just think, oh my God, it didn't have to be this way. This could be the turning point. This could be the Fulgrim that he was always meant to be. Because you're right, he does have this innocence. He's not quite been shaped into this sort of insecure person who's got something to prove. He just kind of wants to help throughout that entire section of the novel that he's in. He just wants to be a helpful person, and he just has that taken away. When he is taken by Trazyn the Infinite, the reason he's taken away is it, and this goes back to this thing I was talking about in the Palantine Phoenix, Fabius Bile does not trust anyone to do things the way that he thinks they need to be done. His perfectionism and insecurity leads him to not trust that Fulgrim will be a different person this time. Even though every single thing points towards things being different, Fabius Bile can't do it. He can't trust the situation.
The obvious conclusion is that Fulgrim can save the Legion. So this is, of course, the want of many of the Emperor's Children. And also Fulgrim. As you say, Fulgrim starts to mature. He starts to show his desire to lead the Legion once more and fix them. And that's originally what Fabius Bile also thinks at the start of the book, is that this version of Fulgrim might save the Emperor's Children from their madness. It could bring at least a good chunk of the Legion back. However, by the end of the novel, we get this really interesting quote where Fabius Bile, of course, considers handing Fulgrim over. He actually says that he must do it for all he's worked towards, because as well as cloned Fulgrim, we also have massive Fabius Bile plot points regarding the new men, regarding Igori, and Fabius Bile knows how powerful Primarchs are. And he can see immediately that Igori, the new men, they're all going to start bowing to this Fulgrim, because you just do. It's what you do when you meet Primarchs. This new Primarch is going to allow everybody to slip back into the old ways, and it will cause the future to burn in the fires of the Phoenix's resurrection. All of Fabius Bile's work will all be for nothing. All that the Emperor's Children had endured and striven for will be undone. He kind of, I think, is chastising himself here. It was such an easy out to believe you could clone the Primarch and that would save the Legion, but it just doesn't work. And the ramifications of this have defined Fabius Bile's character going forwards. And although Clone Grim isn't mentioned kind of by name in Fabius Bile's latest novel with Belisarius Cawl, what we do see is a Fabius Bile that is now convinced that the Space Marines and the Primarchs, including himself, are not the answer. And Clone Grim is the core of this, that Clone Grim will always tend towards damnation. All of the Emperor's progeny, as it were, will always tend towards damnation, because although he doesn't know the details, Fabius Bile clearly suspects the nature of the deal that the Emperor made with the Chaos Gods. So he knows that the answer is not in them. He believes, for example, the answer is his new men, genetic improvements upon the baseline human design, and that he believes they are now perfect. He talks in the book about how this is the classic ideology of the son kills the father. And Fabius Bile supports this idea. He actually believes that his own children, the new men, will kill him someday. He welcomes that because the galaxy should be theirs and the work of the Emperor is forever tainted. People often talk about Clone Grim like he can definitely save the Legion, or he could lead the Sons of the Phoenix chapter or that kind of thing. But honestly, I'm not sure. And certainly Fabius Bile doubts that's what would happen in the future. And he might always tend towards damnation.
See, I'm actually on the side of the argument that I think Clone Fulgrim could have been this force for good. I'm a hopeless optimist and hopeless romantic, though. So I'm always going to tend to the side Clone Fulgrim could have been the hope that brings back, the Legion, as it could and should have been. It's really interesting how the legionaries, the corrupted Emperor's Children legionaries, react to him, because it's almost like they have that hope too. Yeah, Fulgrim's back, and he's not like a snake boy asshole. He can save us now. He actually cares about us again. I'll always be on the side of the argument that maybe he could have done it. I mean, and that's the quintessential tragedy.
I mean, you are not alone, and I know that there are probably many people in the comments talking about this, and it is certainly one of the most popular plot points in relatively recent Warhammer 40k history, because the concept of a loyalist Primarch is objectively fascinating, but I read that book in a completely different way to everybody else. I think I honestly don't believe that the conclusion from that book is that Fulgrim can save the Legion. Certainly, he talks about the Legion like he can save it, but the idea of him being this kind of perfect clone that would stay loyal is not overwhelmingly clear to me. In terms of the practicalities of it, I don't know. It is in that weird space of this is lore that was written by Josh Reynolds, who doesn't write really for Black Library anymore. That doesn't mean that they can't touch his stuff. Like writers can, and they have done before, but they don't like to. They don't like to touch the works and creations of other writers, like Sahal doesn't appear in the Night Lords trilogy, for example. But I will say it is one of the most popular plot points within Warhammer, so it wouldn't be too surprising for me to see that come up in the future.
I couldn't agree more. It's one of those dangling little plot threads that keeps us engaged with the hobby and makes us think, if only.
Yeah. I mean, and certainly you do get this rather heartbreaking moment, really, at the end of Clone Lord. He believes he's saving the Legion, and certainly he believes he's saving his work, to be fair. But the other Emperor's children are begging him and saying, please don't take him from us again. Heart-wrenching.
Yeah. As an Emperor's Children fan.
In terms of the question of is Fulgrim perfect, arguably it's a questionable decision to pick up a sword in a rather suspicious temple, but in a way it makes him relatively more endearing compared to other traitor Primarchs, because if that hadn't happened, the likelihood of him joining Horus in his rebellion is not too clear, is it? And I think that in that respect, the idea that people believe, Fulgrim was the perfect Primarch, or he might have remained perfect, certainly the Emperor saw something in him and his Legion.
Yeah, I think the likelihood of the Emperor's children turning to chaos without the sword is honestly extremely small.
Yeah.
It kind of goes back to this idea of there are multiple small moments that are fulcrum points. One of them is Fabius Bile. Fabius Bile sort of tipping the scales just a little bit, saying we can we can improve the gene seed. That's a little tip in a certain direction. The sword then having this like lots of little taps over a long period of time, and Fulgrim not being able to consider and not having the knowledge to consider that he's not, this force in his head that's talking isn't him. He doesn't have the knowledge requisite to understand what's happening. To me, the character of the Legion is such that I don't see them falling without the sword. And I think if you go back to the Legion, if you go back to the Fulgrim novel, you've always got the two sides playing off against each other. And this is very deliberate that Graham McNeil has done. He shows characters who have everything that the Emperor's Children could be, and then characters that are everything the Emperor's Children become. The two best examples of this are Vespasian and Eidolon, two of the Lord Commanders of the Legion. Eidolon is a dick. Just a relentless dick. And everyone hates him because he's haughty, he's arrogant, he's just aloof, he's not even friendly to anyone. He thinks he's better than everyone. He is the worst extreme of everything that is at the core of the Legion. Then you have the other side. Then you have Vespasian, who is this sort of knight shining exemplar of everything the Emperor's Children could have been. He's very personable. He's very honorable. He listens. He takes on board criticism. He's loved by his troops. He has this really good character. You instantly just kind of like him. And that's on purpose, because it shows the tragedy of what the Legion becomes and what the Legion could have been. And it's the same thing again with Saul Tarvitz and Lucius. They're best friends. But again, you have this dichotomy of the two of them, because you've got Lucius on the one hand, who is absolutely the worst of everything it means to be one of the Emperor's Children. He's arrogant. Everyone kind of dislikes him. And he's very, very good at stuff, but he's actually not as good as he thinks he is. He's not actually super charismatic, but he kind of thinks he is. He's arrogant, haughty. And then you have on the other side, Saul Tarvitz. He's humble, but he takes on board criticism. He has great relations with other legions. He's the consummate loyalist. He's just kind of a great guy. The tragedy of him is he's everything it could have meant to have been one of the Emperor's Children in every conceivable way. And right up until the moment he dies, you see that.
R.I.P. Saul Tarvitz.
Yeah.
Of everyone they didn't bring back, I thought he'd make a re-emergence at some point in the future, especially given the attention that Garrow gets in the series. But yeah, I always thought they missed a trick with the van braces on the models. They should have done the models. You could like connect Garrow and Saul Tarvitz. That would have been epic. But that
would have been so cool.
Yes, I'd be really interested to get more on Rogel Dawn's opinion of Fulgrim. Because one of the things that happens in the book Saturnine, of course, very famously, is that Rogel Dawn sort of beats Fulgrim in a fight, which is quite surprising because Rogel Dawn is not typically thought to be a Blades Master, whereas Fulgrim is, and Fulgrim, I think everyone would put their money on Fulgrim. However, this concept of Rogel Dawn being the Praetorian is brought up once again, just as he did when he beat Alfarius. Rogel Dawn understands his brother so well. That's one of the things that makes him the Praetorian. The way Rogel Dawn knows he can win is because he basically knows that he can force Fulgrim to overcommit. And that's quite interesting because at this point, Rogel Dawn hasn't met demonic Fulgrim. And so I wondered whether that was based off of his analysis of loyalist Fulgrim. I do wonder whether Rogel Dawn had identified this flaw beforehand, because I would imagine in terms of the Emperor's Children fighting style, it is, they're a pretty excellent all-rounder legion.
I think it kind of goes back to a little bit what the Khan was saying about Fulgrim and his legion in general. He's basically saying, like, look, you guys are peacocks. Everyone knows everything about you, and if they don't, you'll shout it at them until they do. Like, but that's not just their strengths and the things they're good at. It's also kind of their weaknesses. It's almost like Rogel Dawn couldn't help but know what Fulgrim's weaknesses were. Because A, he's been planning for this whole time, and B, it's kind of obscenely obvious on purpose.
The other thing that I think that's worth bearing in mind when it comes to Fulgrim's loyalty is that he doesn't even get a mention in the Dauntless Few, which you might think that he does, because if Ferrus Manus does, for example, but Fulgrim doesn't even come up. He seems like a relatively obvious choice, and I guess it goes to your point there earlier, Quipster, about how maybe it's because Fulgrim is so difficult to work with because of his arrogance, and when it comes to the Dauntless Few, it's not necessarily the best fighters, it's the legions that Guilliman considers the most dependable. And the idea that Fulgrim isn't a dependable Primarch to Guilliman, I think is quite interesting. When it comes to Fulgrim's fighting style, I guess it's worth mentioning a little bit about his track record. He doesn't do so great against Rogel Dawn, but he pretty handedly smashes Ferrus Manus twice. The book's moving quite quickly when we get to this point in the story, but Ferrus Manus seems to be quite easily outmatched. He's quite confident going into the fight as well, but Ferrus Manus and later the demon that controls Ferrus Manus, they seem to have the upper hand. And of course, you know, I guess what makes Fulgrim very unique in terms of Primarchs, traitorous Primarchs, is that he has sort of killed 2 Primarchs now. He killed Ferrus Manus, but he also sort of killed Rabute Guilliman. And no doubt this will be coming up again in the future. Fulgrim was very angry when Guilliman was kind of brought back to life. But the Dark Prince must have been very happy with Fulgrim when this happened, because having the only Primarch to have killed 2 of his brothers, or near enough, is quite a cool claim to have, I think.
100%. I mean, who are the other brothers that come close? I mean, Rogel Dawn killed Alfarius.
Rogel Dawn's a great track record, yeah.
Yeah.
Horus Lupercal, of course. Sanguinis.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll have to do a stream one day talking about the victory tallies. People love Fulgrim's comments to Jaghatai Khan. We'll have to do a video one day talking about the outcomes of each fight and the boasting of each Primarch, because it's also quite funny. Like, you know, Lehman Russ's analysis is questionable, I think, but that's biased as a Dark Angels fan. So
it's actually funny listening to how Marines talk about their dads as well. There's a bit where one of the Ultramarines is talking about Guilliman, and he's saying that, like, oh yes, of course Guilliman is one of the best fighters among the Primarchs. There's maybe 3, at most 4, who could take him in a fight. And as someone who's reading this, you're kind of like, I mean, is that true? I mean, it's only Guilliman. It's funny listening to like their perspectives on these things and how they're warped as well, and how our perceptions on these things are warped as well.
But that's it for today's live stream. Thank you so much to everybody who has watched the channel and supported the channel. Really can't stress enough how much that means to me, guys. If you enjoy this kind of content, please do consider supporting the channel, and you can get access to more members content if you do so, as well as getting access to the Discord. As I say, Quipster and I, we've been talking a lot about making these podcasts a regular thing. So let us know in the comments what kind of things you want us to cover. We will no doubt be talking more about Fulgrim in the future as we find out more about his return in the books to come over the next couple of months. Stay tuned for that. But let us know what you guys think of the concept of a perfect Fulgrim or a loyalist Fulgrim as well. Yeah, we'll see you guys next time.